Hi there. In this video I want to address a topic that's very close to my heart, and that's native speakerism. And more specifically, I want to talk about what we can do as teachers or materials writers to discuss this topic with our students in classes and why we should do so. So let's get started. Before we get right down to it, if you're new here, my name is Marek Kiczkowiak and I run TEFL Equity Advocates and Academy, where I help English teachers tackle native speakerism and teach English for global communication. So first of all, let's perhaps address the question that some of you might be having, which is, what is native speakerism? Native speakerism can be seen as a prejudice, stereotyping, and or discrimination, typically by or against foreign language teachers, on the basis of either being or not being perceived and categorized as a native speaker of a particular language. Its endorsements positions individuals from certain language groups as being innately superior to individuals of other language groups. If you're thinking that this is perhaps a little bit too theoretical, let me give you a more practical example and an analogy. Think of native speakerism like other isms such as sexism or racism, but unlike sexism, which is based on someone's perceived belonging to a gender and all the characteristics and stereotypes associated with it, or racism, which is based on the prejudices and stereotypes associated with belonging to a particular race, native speakerism is based on all the prejudices and stereotypes that we associate with people who we perceive to belong to a native speaker group or not belong to that native speaker group. If you want to find out more about native speakerism, then check out my other video where I go into much more details about it, and the link is right below the video. So first of all, in order to know how you can address it with your students and discuss it, I think it's really important to very briefly mention how native speakerism is promoted, maintained, perpetuated. As any other ideology, native speakerism is promoted through and maintained through what seem like common sense discourses or beliefs that are also very widespread. And then these are further maintained and perpetuated in what again seem like common sense practices. So to give you an example, one of the fundamental native speakerist beliefs is the idea that native speakers make better pronunciation teachers, for example. And as a result, this is further perpetuated in what to a lot of people seems like a common sense practice, to employ native speakers only. You might be thinking, why would I want to discuss this topic with my students? Well, I think it's really important because a lot of students will start classes and courses with certain prejudices, certain stereotypes that they might have, for example, from the previous experience or from the things they've read in the language school's promotional materials and so on. They might start the courses with stereotypes that native speakers are, for example, better teachers because they have a better, more correct accent or something like this. And while those initial prejudices and stereotypes might change throughout the course, I think it's really important to address these issues head on in our classes, as you might want to address other important issues such as, for example, sexism or racism, or also other issues such as, for example, climate change. Another reason is that also many recruiters tend to base their discriminatory recruitment policies on what they perceive to be a very strong demand for native speakers from students. And also some publishers, for example, might be reluctant to include more non-native speaker voices in their course books because of what they perceive to be a potential negative reaction from students and from teachers. That's why I think addressing these native speakerist ideas head on in our classes can help tackle these ideas. So how can you discuss native speakerism with your students? I think you have two main options. Option 1 is to prepare entire lesson plans and devote most of your lesson to this topic. And I want to now show you an example lesson plan, which you can also download below this video if you're interested. So to start this activity, you will need a couple of photos of typical language schools ads, and we'll be showing them to our students and asking them a couple of questions to discuss while they are looking at the ads. And here are sample questions. Obviously, they will need to be adjusted for the level of your students and so on. For example, have you ever seen similar pictures on language school ads or brochures? What image of the English language and its users do they give? You can prompt students with different things like nationality, race, age, and so on. And to what extent is this image accurate and why? In other words, do these images really reflect who uses English nowadays or not, and why not? And then in here I've chosen a couple of images that I took on the internet, but you could obviously use the images that you feel are the most appropriate in your particular context. So this is one image where we've obviously got a very typical image of an American flag and a white person, and I'm going to mention that in a second. In here, I took that picture in Munich. Sorry about the quality of it. But again, we've got a very stereotypical image of someone from New Zealand, right? And in here, we've got some ads to study to become an English teacher. Now, your students can give different answers, but one of the predominating themes that you can draw your attention to is that obviously we have young, white, Western-looking, very happy people using English, and they're obviously from, stereotypically from native-speaking countries, or those countries that are perceived as native-speaking countries, such as the US or New Zealand. And these ads are really based on some quite worrying, I would say, stereotypes about these countries and these peoples. And then you could, after getting some feedback, discussing these pictures, this could take a while depending on your group, but it really generates a lot of discussion. You could get into simple activity about recruitment. So you could tell your students to imagine that they are recruiting a new teacher for their language school, right? And then they will need to discuss the following questions. For example, what qualifications, experience, skills are necessary, what requirements might be inappropriate, right? So, for example, asking about the candidate gender, the photograph, and so on, right? And get students to design an ad, right? To get them to think about really the qualities of the new teacher that they should have. And then you could show them an ad. Again, I took an ad of a real ad from the internet. I think it's really important that you take a picture of a real ad. So we've got some authentic materials here. And you could use any ad that you think will be appropriate in your context. And get the students to think whether this ad is appropriate. Why or why not? Right? And then once the students have discussed whether that previous ad was appropriate, they can then start writing their own ad here, where they will list the necessary qualifications, experience, teaching skills, and so on that they think are really, really important in an English teacher. Of course, it might not always be possible or desirable to devote a whole lesson to such a controversial topic like native speakerism. That's why the second option of discussing it with your students is to simply try to sneak it in to different parts of different lessons and basically do less of it more often. So just to give you a practical example, imagine your students are learning how to write an application letter or an application email for a job. And there's plenty of lessons like that in many course books. I'm sure you've done one lesson like that. So you might have, for example, a job ad for for a particular job, and you could add to the requirements being a native speaker or speaking a language as a mother tongue, and simply add an extra question to the discussion activity where you ask your students to what extent they think such a requirement is fair. And you don't really need to spend any additional time on that in class. It can just be a 5-minute thing. It can be just one question that you insert to a larger lesson plan that has nothing to do with native speakerism. But if you do this often enough, I think the idea will also start to sink in. So in this lesson, I tried to show you what you can do as a teacher or materials writer to address native speakerism in your classes or in your materials. If you want to find out more, then definitely check out the slides from this recording so you can use the lesson plan that I showed you, and also check out my courses on TEFL Equity Academy, and the link is right below this video. And let me know in the comments section how you decided to address the issue of native speakerism with your students.